Welcome to Adapter's Advantage, breakthrough moments that lead to success. Our podcast brings you insider stories of the moments that mattered, turning points on the sometimes rocky road to success. Here's your host, Mark Magnacca, president and co-founder of Allego, the workforce training and readiness platform built for distributed teams.
Hi, this is Mark Magnacca. Today, my guest on the Adapter's Advantage podcast is Tim Riesterer, Chief Strategy Officer at Corporate Visions, who's dedicated at Corporate Visions. He and the team are dedicated to helping companies improve the conversations they're having with prospects and customers to win more business. And as a little frame of reference, they've done this with 70,000 salespeople in the last year with more than 220 companies. So Tim and the team really are among the foremost experts in the world now on what's happening in this adaptive change that's happening everywhere in the post-COVID environment. He's been called a visionary research, a thought leader, a keynote speaker, and a practitioner with more than 20 years of experience in marketing and sales management. Tim's the co-author of 4 books, including Customer Message Management, Conversations That Win the Complex Sale, The 3 Value Conversations, and most recently, The Expansion Sale, which we'll talk a little bit more about. So Tim, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Mark, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
So Tim, after I kind of go through that introduction of all the different things you've done, from being an author to being a trainer to keynote speaking, when people ask you, so you're at Corporate Visions, what do you do? How do you answer that question?
Yeah, the name of the company could mean anything, right? My title, Chief Strategy Officer, can mean anything. So I kind of got the best of any. I could just pick and choose. So Chief Strategy Officer in our world is I'm in charge of the research. So we do a lot of decision science, brain science, behavioral science research about how humans frame value, make choices, and then we teach that and we consult on that in the B2B realm. So I run the research operation. We then productize that into consulting and training engagements. So I have the products team that rolls up to me, and then we deliver that. We have consultants and trainers, and the whole delivery team also is my responsibility. So it's a great job to identify these cool concepts, trends, and techniques, productize that, and then bring that to the market, deliver it in a way that has impact on these companies.
Well, Tim, one of the things that I've noticed in the years I've known you and having read a lot of the things that you've written, is a recognition that you have this tonal awareness that not everybody who's a good salesperson necessarily has that capacity to put their ear to the ground and understand the bigger trend that's happening, particularly if they're siloed in one industry. And so one of the questions that I have, just for people to get to know you a little bit more, is as a kid who went to the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, how do you start there, with all due respect to that institution, and kind of transcend to being one of the most sought after and respected thought leaders in the entire industry as it relates to sales training?
You know, it's funny. It is not the bastion, let's say, of just about anything. But it was I chose it because it was in a big city, and I was going to be a journalist, and I chose a path of mass communications and journalism because I was an insanely curious person, but I also love to write. And that took me actually into the PR world. I got hired in corporate PR. And so I think, that many years ago, I was sort of the first corporate journalist. That's now a thing in all of our content marketing world. But I was sent on the road to do case studies, customer case studies. So ride along with salespeople, do case studies on how customers were using our stuff. At the time, I worked for GE Healthcare, all the medical equipment. And then I went to work for a company called Rockwell Automation. So I was into factory automation. And so very B2B from the get-go, riding along with a lot of salespeople and being inside the customer's operations and writing about what they were doing, what they were accomplishing, the impact and outcomes of our stuff. And what I learned very quickly, being with salespeople and customers, is the stuff that marketing writes and talks about, it has no relevance in the field. I remember one story in particular. A salesperson went around. This is back in the day when they had brochures. They opened up their trunk. They showed me boxes of brochures. And then we went on ride-alongs to multiple hospitals that day, and not one brochure was handed out. He's like, see, this is where this stuff goes. This is what we do out here. And I had this profound moment because I was hired by marketing going, holy crap, we have it all wrong. The customer lives in their story and we live in our story. And we keep trying to force the customer to love our story when we need to figure out how to live in a relevant way in theirs. And that was the pivotal moment. And I'm so fortunate that I got pushed out into the field, riding along with salespeople, meeting with customers and hearing them talk about what they're trying to accomplish versus sitting in the ivory tower and marketing, falling in love with our products.
The reason that the tension so often exists between sales and marketing, I call it like the tension between John and Paul in the Beatles. There's this creative tension that sometimes if you can make it work, it's magic, but a lot of times it's just a grind between the two of them. And too often it's the sales organization doesn't really understand what marketers have to contend with. And the marketing organization doesn't actually understand what salespeople do day in and day out, like your guy in the hospital.
Yeah, and I remember one story vividly because you can even take marketing and sales out of the equation. And I know it sounds trite to say put the customer at the center, but we were there talking to a pediatric cardiologist, so a cardiologist who works on kids. And I got the chance to go into the cath lab, gown up and all that, because we were interviewing him about the use of our x-ray equipment for cardiac cath. And we're in the middle of a procedure, kid on the table, under anesthesia, and the system crashes. It goes down. And the doctor turns to me and says, we probably can't do this today because I'm about to interview him on the use of the equipment. And he had tears in his eyes. And I started to realize that it isn't about marketing and sales. It's about that moment and what the customer's trying to accomplish and do and what their mission is and how we do or don't impact that. And I've never looked back. I can remember the doctor's name, can't say it here, but it was Detroit Pediatric Children's Hospital. It's vivid, seared in my memory. And it literally has been sort of a guiding beacon for how to think about messaging and sales conversations and presentations. And it's literally sort of informed why studying the brain of the buyer instead of the actions of the marketer or seller is the center of all that we do.
You know, Tim, I appreciate that's a fascinating insight, first of all, and it helps me to connect some dots here because you used a word earlier that I believe is central to great salespeople, great marketers, and that is this word curiosity, like this innate sense of wanting to know. And I mean, just think about how many other people who worked for the company that you started with, whether it was at GE, had actually been in the cath lab and could use the nomenclature, use the jargon, right? And then to have that doctor in that moment, what that story does for me is it helps me understand how you help people take a deeper meaning, bring a deeper meaning to what it is they're actually selling. Because when you have that feeling about it and you recognize, like, I'm not selling life insurance, I'm selling the ability for children to go to college because their mother or father died prematurely. Like, that's a very different thing than just thinking about the product or the the x-ray equipment in the cath lab. Like, yeah, that could be your child on that table, right? And so when all of a sudden you think of it that way, it informs, I think, us in a different way, and it causes us to bring a different level of importance to it versus I'm selling a product.
Yeah, I've always believed you almost need to have a belief system and an evangelical zeal for what you're doing to really be that authentic consultative salesperson, because you absolutely to the core of your being know that they're going to accomplish what they want to accomplish because of what you have. And I believe that people toss around the word authenticity, but I mean, authenticity can't be faked is all I'm saying. And so having a sincere belief in what you're helping somebody accomplish, it just will ooze out of you in the story. It'll ooze out of you in the interaction. You made a little fun of my alma mater, but the idea of the skill set, the core skill set of being a journalist, being able to, one, be curious and ask a lot of questions, two, be able to summarize clearly and simply and concretely and be able then to bring that back or bring that forward to somebody in a way that's interesting and meaningful is just a core life skill set. So I'll be honest, I'm not necessarily biased to hiring from my alma mater, but I am a little biased to finding people who have a bit of a J school background.
I love it, Tim, and it's so great to hear because so many, the community of journalism, the whole profession has been so hammered in this political environment, right? It's been so hard to be in that role that's a central element of our democracy, right? But you wouldn't know that necessarily at this moment in time. Frankly, if I was the University of Wisconsin Milwaukee, I'd be having you on billboards and be like, look at what happens. You take this class. So
well, yeah, I'm just going to say that the right core skill set and a lot of hard work and a few good breaks all work together. So, but just to kind of put a bow on that whole idea is that I think we're talking about sort of the core psychology of a marketer and seller, and the idea of being sort of connected to the core psychology of the buyer. And so that's why all the work we do is rooted in what we call the decision science. It's the psychology of the buyer and all those involved, recognizing that that's, in some ways, that's who we are. That is how we exist, and being able to operate in that way, in a meaningful way, not a manipulative way, but a meaningful way, we think is really, really important and powerful, and not superficial.
It's interesting that you say that. This example, as you said that, Tim, you may be aware of this, but for our listeners, there's a guy who's known as the father of public relations, a guy by the name of Edward Bernays. Do you know that name?
Oh yeah, had to read the books, had to swear allegiance, to Edward Bernays and P.T. Barnum, So.
Well, the thing is about Edward Bernays, just a really interesting anecdote about that. So he was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, first of all. So he comes from a family that was steeped in this tradition of psychology. But one of the most fascinating stories I heard was he was working for the Duncan Hines organization. And this is in the 50s. And it was right at the point where more and more women were going back to work. And previous to this, sort of pre-World War II, most women made cakes from scratch. That was sort of what you did. And then by the 50s, Duncan Hines and others had developed ways to make a cake that didn't require anything but water. And as he started to do the research in the way that you did, and he spent some time talking to these women, they basically said, I feel like I'm not giving myself to my family. I'm working and I don't have time to do it from scratch. But the result of it is I don't feel good about the cake that I'm making because it's not from scratch. And Bernays is the one that went back to them and said, you know what? I know you don't need this. Adjust the formula so that the person making the cake needs to crack an egg and put the egg in. And the act of putting the egg into the mix as you mix it up created a different dynamic. Like I'm not just putting part of myself into it, but there's an element of love that's different than just mixing it up. And so to me, this journey of really understanding the buyer's psychology. Now, some people say, well, that's just gratuitous. No, it's not. Because if the end result that the buyer, in this case, the mom making the cake, actually had a feeling of, was able to transmit this feeling of love for her family, that's very much a real thing.
Yeah, it's they're not to get trite, but the idea of a perception that creates your reality, and our ability to choose how we respond and react in our reality is what essentially makes us human. And so I think we're at the essence of humanness here. And anybody tuning in did not expect this conversation.
And let's talk about the expansion sale, because literally I sent you this email. My co-founder, Yu-Chun Lee, read the book. He's the one that sent it to my whole sales team. And he literally doesn't do this. I think he's only done it for one other book. Sent the book and the link and said, buy this, you need to read it. What was the origin of you deciding to write this book? And then what's the big idea from the book that our listeners should be paying attention to?
Yeah, so it's kind of an accidental origin, like a lot of things are, if you're just listening again. So for our organization, builds messages, content assets, and teaches sales skills. And for almost a decade, we've been sort of on the train of the provocation-based sale. And there were signs to back it up, by the way. It wasn't like, hey, everybody just got on the let's provoke, let's challenge train. Underlying that is this idea that people live in status quo. And in order to win more business or new business, you must convince people that their status quo is uncertain and no longer safe, and they need a new safe. And it just is what's required to get people to change, decide to change and choose you. You have to be the person creating that vision inside somebody, like, there's a better way. The current way is no longer sustainable, tenable, or safe. So for 10 years, we've been building messaging, content, and training salespeople to have that dialogue. Well, we astutely so, some of our customers said, now, wait a minute. Should we be defeating status quo bias when we are the status quo? Like we're talking, and I'm like, oh, and
I'm Coca-Cola or I'm McDonald's, right? And so I'm the standard.
Yeah, and so is it? And they were like, guess what? Like 70 to 80% of our business this year, our number we're going to hit is from existing customers, ensuring we renew them and sell them more stuff. Do we use the same motion, this idea of disrupting, defeating, and dislodging status quo bias, or should we be doing something else? And because we're very research oriented and want to understand the psychology of the buyer, we said, essentially, does the psychology of the buyer, and as a result, does the story you tell them and the skills with which you tell it change from one scenario to the other? There's a piece of science called fundamental attribution error, where we tend to overestimate someone's disposition. In this case, I would say a title or a persona, and we underestimate the impact of the situation, like what the installed scenario is. Fundamental attribution error says that the real driver of what somebody does, their behaviors, their decisions, is their situation, more so than their disposition. So I'm like, wait, it's not the persona of a CFO we're selling to. It's the CFO at a prospective company who's using someone else versus the CFO at an existing company where we're partnered and we've had impact and investment. Yes. And it turns out, when we did the research, that existing customers do react differently to a message from their incumbent partner. And that if you go in with guns a-blazing, like, hey, it's been a good ride so far, but we got all this new, right. And we found new needs and we found new ideas. Yeah. And then the person's like, whoa, wait, if we have to change that much anyways, let's make sure we're doing the right thing. And let's look at everybody. Like, you literally disrupted yourself. Wow. When the reality is you want to build on, and again, it sounds obvious now, but what we discovered is that status quo bias must be defeated in one case and reinforced in the other. You should show the impact before you talk about anything new. Remind them of the impact you've had. Show them the mutual investment that's been made. And that impact and investment becomes your incumbent advantage, speaking of politics. And the idea of incumbent advantage is, why wouldn't you leverage that in your story? Why would you come into an existing customer telling essentially the same new story as your competitors? Now you all sound the same, and you've given up your incumbent advantage. Instead, use your incumbent advantage to say, hey, we've accomplished this so far. We've both made these investments. So you've anchored them on positive results, and you've shown them a sunk cost that they don't want to do again. And then you take them on a little journey that says, while we've been working with you, we've observed these things, and then we've compared it to the things we're seeing when we work with others like you. This is a unique perspective. It's different than the perspective of the provocateur who comes in from the outside, like lobbing hand grenades. You have a view of inside and people like them because you work with them outside. And now you bring them the story of, like, here's what needs to happen next. And that vantage point disappears if you launch a new product and you say the same thing to your prospects as you do to your customers. And it's all about what's new. And now you've given up the incumbent advantage, when that should be like a firewall. That should be a moat where everybody goes, it's interesting what the competitors are saying, but I would put this investment at risk. I would be putting this impact at risk. I have a better chance of future value by working with someone who's demonstrated this versus trying something brand new. Unfortunately, everybody seems to take a one-size-fits-all approach. I was just talking to the CMO of a major medical manufacturer the other day, and he's like, when we launch a new product, we say the exact same thing to both audiences. And he was like, absolutely keenly aware of that. The situation drives the story and the skills because the psychology is different.
Tim, when I first read it, I remember when the book first came out, I got it on Kindle. And I remember stopping and I thought to myself, how did I miss this?
Yeah, it seems so obvious now, right? So we did a study on renewals, and then we did a study on price increases, and then we did a study on upsells and cross sells, and then eventually we did a study on apologies for service problems. But in those core three, renewals, price increases, and upsells, every time the story that anchored on positive impact and mutual investment and effort, if you will, started with the incumbent advantage and moved toward the rest of the story, it won handily against a story in all three of those cases with that sort of provocative why change sort of message. So we were like, wow, this is amazing, because everybody had bought into the hyperbole of provocation based selling. And you know who was not impressed and who was like, no, duh? The scientist we did the work with. So I'm not a scientist myself. So we do this work with professors, Professor Zach Tormala, who's at the Stanford School of Business. So he runs these simulations for us. And so we have academic rigor around it. He makes sure the test conditions are fair. And then we do it in Europe with a gentleman, Dr. Nick Lee at Warwick Business School. And they both ran these studies for us. And they were the least impressed by the results because they said, yay for you, you just proved that status quo bias is real. And we've known that we've known that for 40 years. So congratulations. And I'm like, no, you don't understand. This is a big deal in our industry. Again, but when you sit back, you go, oh, it seems obvious, but no, it's not at least the way companies approach it. They approach it as a one size fits all approach, and that's what's got to change.
And I think most sales training approaches it in just that way.
Product marketing, sales training, sales process. It really is a one size fits all approach. Now, the only thing that's sort of happened that we're like, somebody's getting it, is this category of customer success has emerged, and everybody's kind of getting this feel like maybe, just maybe, we should apply a little unique muscle to the customer success piece of the business, because so much is riding on it. But customer success by their very nature is about project level implementation success. The sales executive needs to be part of that discussion, because you need to maintain executive altitude. The decider needs to be kept informed all the way along towards renewal, because if it dips down to just project level engagement, they're going to lose sight of what's going on. And it just becomes it sort of disappears into the operating motion. And then all of a sudden renewals come and you want to try and upsell them. And all of a sudden everybody's like, well, wait, what were they doing? And so then you get nervous and you just start, again, pegging all the new into the story, because you're like, I got to re-energize this thing. And then you unwittingly did the exact wrong thing. You created disruption.
It's great. I can't wait to share this with our customer success team, because we put so much emphasis. We recognize how important it is. And one of the things I appreciate with our customer success team, Tim, is exactly what you just described, a recognition that particularly if there's a change with an executive sponsor, that we need to maintain that level of knowledge for the new person coming into that executive role. So if our executive sponsor has departed into a different division or from the company, and then someone new comes in, we can't just plug along as if the new person who's in charge of signing the contract upon renewal knows about all of that past history, because in most cases they don't.
No, they don't. They aren't like jumping in to get all of the history of the decision and all the considerations that went into it. In fact, they're kind of showing up thinking, I got to make my mark. There's a bias that goes with this idea of I have to do something different and new to make my mark.
Oh, true.
So your job as a seller is to make sure that you're holding executive business reviews. And in that executive business review, reviewing impact, and not just project level impact. You have to ramp that up to department and business level impact. And we could talk more about that if you want, but that's the big deal. And you want to pull that executive to both the previous purchase decision. We even say, remind the group of how diligent and arduous their process was, because you want them to know they went through a lot to pick you. Right. And why would they want to do that again? And it reminds them of all the startup costs that they've sunk now that they don't have to go back and do again, the onboarding, the systems integration, the process change. So time, money, stomach lining has been invested to get this thing where it is. And sometimes they need to be reminded of it. Just in a quick sort of recap, because you want that new person to be drawn into the decision and realize that why would they want to do, they got some impact, they've made this investment. Why would you want to do that over again? And we think they just know those things. but we're kidding ourselves if they're sitting around taking inventory of the impact and the investment they've made. They're just trying to keep the wheels on their organization.
You're
It's
right.
really, it's our job to help remind and reinforce.
Tim, when you said that, I couldn't help but think that in my own experience with our customer success and our account management team, this word that you used before of curiosity, there are times when I'll be listening to account review, and the way you were talking about being in the cath lab and being able to talk about radiology just from having been exposed to it, there are times when our people actually sound like they work for our customer because they've paid attention to the business. So my question to you is, you've worked with 70,000 salespeople. What do you think is the most important way to either find or to help generate that curiosity that you seem to have had innately from your journalism past, to not just ask questions, but to meaningfully want to understand what is the problem we're trying to solve?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that there's a lot of our assessment tools and interview tools that don't cover off on this, right? And so how well do they demonstrate the ability to be curious about you and your organization, versus just share their triumphs, right? And how well can they articulate the business problems they solved for their clients at their previous jobs? Have them tell you a story, not of their best sale and how they ran that deal cycle, but how they ingratiated themselves into the customer, and just see if they light up with enthusiasm for the impact that they were able to have. I think there are certainly some skills that they can come in with, but I believe these are things that are learnable and modelable and coachable, because I know your organization might say, you know what I really need is someone with a little bit of domain expertise, because that will give them the ability to be curious. Now I just want to inspire them to be curious about it, not self-focused, but other focused. So I think you can interview for the traits just to see how they talk about it, right? Do they talk about their entrenchment and enrichment of the customer experience and their impact and outcomes, or is it all just about the sales conquest and putting another notch in their belt?
Well said. That's a very good way to have a framework to get at this indirectly. So that leads me to an article that you wrote recently called "Virtual Training Can Be Better Than in the Classroom." When I first shared it with my own team, there was no question. There was this is the early COVID time. Some initial skepticism and pushback, like, "Come on, how is virtual training actually better than being in the classroom?" So what do you say to the listeners who might at this moment be of a mindset that there's no way a virtual event can be as good as a live event?
Well, the research we did for that was some serious controlled field trials with a very large software firm who used their data scientists to run a controlled A/B/C test. A, traditional classroom; B, an asynchronous model of the exact same content, but with e-learning and with what we call fluency coaching, sort of the online submission and review. And then the third group was the non-trained group. You needed your controlled group. And by the end of it, we were able to show 90 days post that the virtual results, so people who took the virtual experience, actually increased their confidence level twice as much as the people who took the live classroom. The ACV was about the same. 90 days out, it increased. Both of them increased about the same over the non-trained group. The pipeline, the e-learning group outperformed the classroom. And then when we ask a bunch of preference questions afterward, the sellers who experienced it themselves said they much preferred the timing and the spaced and the experience of the asynchronous experience versus the classroom. So on all levels, we were able to say, virtual can be as good or better than live. KPIs, personal scores, etc. Well, that research actually happened a year before COVID. And the article you're talking about was I went back and rewrote an article that I had written a year previous, because even with that evidence, only 10% of our clients said, I'm going to try that virtual thing. 90% were like, I need the classroom. So therefore they scheduled their classes for months out. And we had even one client come to us and say, we're having trouble finding conference room and meeting and classroom space. Could you provide a service, your project managers, where you could go out and find us classroom, conference room, and meeting room space? I mean, that sounds like Fred Flintstone question right now, but literally they couldn't find space so they could get people in classrooms fast enough. And they asked if we could do that. And then February hits, and all of a sudden we went from doing 120 classroom-based training events a month to now we're doing 250 virtual events a month. So people went from 10% okay with doing virtual to now 100%. And now they're starting to realize all the things that we were talking about. Number one, the speed. I can get everybody in and up and running now, and so scale at speed versus waiting for a classroom to open up and then putting someone on a calendar. They need this stuff now, not later, if you're going to impact the business. And everyone needs it as soon as you can. The other thing that they're starting to realize is, why would I start writing a check again for an additional 50% of the cost of training that comes with travel and room rental, all the expenses that go with it, not even counting opportunity cost of taking people out of the field. And as they watch the results coming in now, they're starting to see that behavior change is possible. Now, that said, just putting someone in a webcast as a pale imitation of the classroom is not going to get the job done. There are limitations in the classroom that virtual can solve, but just putting a webcast on, I argue, is a pale imitation of some constraints that already exist. You actually have to rethink this thing. And so I'm not saying you don't have web moments where you bring people together, break them into groups, teach backs, coaching, feedback, exercises, and examples. The thing that really turned it for us, we discovered, is asking somebody then afterward to, in a capstone moment, record themselves, submit that, and have a rubric that somebody reviews and provides detailed coaching and feedback. Because what doesn't happen in the classroom is exactly that. Nobody practices very much because you're crushed for time. And so they practice very little before their little stand and deliver. Nobody does a complete assignment because of the classroom size. You put people in groups. So everybody does a partial assignment. So limited practice, limited exercise time because you're part of a group and not having to do the complete assignment. Limited coaching time in a classroom because time is of the essence. The instructor's trying to think on the fly and give like 3 or 4 of you feedback on your presentation, and nobody's taking notes on that. And it goes by you like a mist because you're just glad it's over, right? You just want to you're thinking about a beer at that point because you survived the role play because everybody hates the role play. Well, if you now have people submit their assignments, we've discovered on systems like yours that people will practice 6.8 times before they hit the submit button. I would submit that's like 5.8 more times than they practice in a classroom setting. They do a complete assignment because now they can do the complete assignment versus a fractional assignment. And what do they get? They get written, documented, detailed feedback and ideas for remediation that both the manager and the player get. And none of that happened in the classroom environment. And now you can start to see why their confidence goes up because they practice more, why their competence goes up because they did a complete assignment, and really how they become more compelling because they've gotten detailed feedback that they can respond to. None of that happens in a live in-person classroom. So I believe there's a bit of unexamined folklore when it comes to the idea that there's more behavior change in a classroom. And it comes from the fact that people have done virtual in a pale imitation of the classroom format versus rethinking the experience.
That's a great point, Tim. And I can't help but think about, as you describe it, how ironic it is really that in every other profession, the profession of being a pilot, for example, or being a doctor, of course you have to demonstrate. You have to go through an internship. There's a methodology around practicing in a safe environment before you practice on a live person or in a live airplane, right? And so the fact that this whole framework existed, that you could just wing it, and kind of get through that, and then I'm good to go. the piece that's jumping out at me as I'm listening to you is we still have customers that say our average onboarding time, and this is taking COVID into account, the expectation is our past experience tells us it takes 9 to 12 months to ramp a salesperson to the point of productivity. And I just can't seem to get my head wrapped around, based on what you've just said, why should that be the case? And is that maybe the same unexamined folklore? Because there is a better way to have someone on a success track, so that maybe it takes more than 90 days. So maybe it's 6 months, but for it to take almost a year for a new salesperson to get ramped who's already got industry or domain knowledge, does that make sense to you?
No, and it shouldn't. And I think there's just one more big idea that we've stumbled upon too in this world now that virtual is becoming in vogue, because it has to, is vital. Is that the training isn't like, okay, here's our standalone skills training, and then here's our product training, and then here's our domain training, and everybody's got to like take the training in those silos and then figure out how to bring them together. We're seeing more enablement and training being done situationally. Okay, this is a scenario we face in the market. Here's a message, here's some content assets, and here's some skills to address that. So we just had a client who had something changed in their world around contracts and pricing, and it was going to be a big deal. And so we helped them build some messaging, build a couple content assets, and put people into practice sessions where they had to, the client likes to call it, be fit for duty, and stood that up in a couple of weeks. And everybody went through it, like hundreds of people could get through it in a week or two, as opposed to the traditional method. And so by getting somebody ready for that situation, and then integrating the message, the content, and the skills into a relevant moment, we were able to see a lot more uptake and adoption. And we were comfortable they were going to be successful because there was a level of fit for duty attached to it. None of the traditional learning paths and things you describe about onboarding has any of that. I call that just in case training. We teach them something just in case they're going to use it, and we hope they remember it when it is required, as opposed to just in time training of the example I just shared with you. Something pops up and you equip and enable them for that moment, because now they're ready to learn, because they're in some sort of deficit. So honestly, the marketing and sales and enablement and training world is converging into these moments where these things happen in an integrated way different than traditional onboarding, which was chunks to check a box.
Tim, there's so much here. We're going to have to do this again. I have one more question before we wrap up, because I think this is the tip of the iceberg. And I think this conversation is spot on for so many of the people in our world. And that includes our customers and our partners and so many people. You're sort of articulating with a very fine point this convergence that we're seeing. And given your unique background in marketing and sales and journalism, one of the things that we're seeing that comes to that word integration that you just used is this notion of sales enablement needing to now provide what I'll call seller activation. And one part of seller activation is content activation. So it's not enough to have the PDF document. Going way back to your initial story with the guy with all the PDF or the brochures in his trunk, right? It's not enough to have that document. But how sad is it that marketing has spent so much time, energy, and effort to build this document, but they didn't have an example of what a great seller using that document looks like to activate it. And thus this, depending upon who you believe, as much as 90% of content that marketing creates doesn't get used effectively. And so there's this sort of churning process. And then what we realized is that what if there was a way for marketing, as they're doing it, kind of going back to the egg and Edward Bernays, to embed sales in the process. So not like at the quarterly meeting, oh, by the way, this is the thing we're coming out with. This is our first draft of it. We want a little bit of your feedback. You're putting the egg in, and we're going to cycle this 3 or 4 more times in a week, and then we're going to publish it. What's your experience around this notion of content activation as it relates to modern selling?
Yeah, I think when the sales content management space came out, it just became a digital car trunk. So it's like, okay, it's more accessible and it's more updated because it's central and it's online and we can continually keep it up to date. And we went, yay, you no longer have to go to your trunk. But to your point, again, it's kind of like taking classroom training and doing a pale imitation with a webcast. You get to rethink this thing. And the idea of content activation, where we always believe that messaging and content is something that should be built together with sales. It's a cross-functional thing. The people who know and are subject matter experts on the product, and the people who know and are subject matter experts on the customer and what they will respond to and how it will engage and what experience it will create, should be coming together. And the idea that something is built and then it's maybe tried, tested, and then feedback in an iterative, or it's built initially with a cross-functional team, and then that team goes out and pilots it and you redo it. This is something we've believed in for a while. It requires a cross-functional team to build that story, because then you've got all hands in it, right? And there's a level of agreement as a company that this is our best foot forward in front of the customer from both sides. I'll give you marketing and sales perspective. So yes, absolutely believe that the message and then the content asset itself and how it functions need to be done as a team.
Tim, I'd say it's a pleasure to have this conversation with you. And I think as people listen, what you're really doing is causing, at least in my own experience, a refreshing update of the point of views that many of us have had. Too often, they're not backed by any data. They're backed just by sort of an intuitive feeling about things. And when something like COVID happens, for the average person, if they don't have 70,000 person database to in effect fact check it against, it's very easy, just like in the realm of social media, to be in an echo chamber where you're believing your own PR, so to speak. And I think what you're bringing to the table is just a much broader based understanding of the trends that are at hand, that quite frankly, if you're not at least paying attention to, you're doing so at your own peril, whether you're in sales or in marketing.
People are figuring this out. We've been forced to figure it out. And it is an opportunity. It's an equalizer that creates an opportunity for somebody to figure out how to break through. So we're excited about it because we think that that there is a lot of creativity and imagination that's being unleashed, and also a lot of people being forced to try new things. So that's making some lemonade out of the lemons for sure.
Well said. Tim, if people want to find the expansion sale, Amazon.com, anywhere online?
Yeah, anywhere online. It was published by McGraw-Hill, so it's legit. And so I've done, no offense to any other bookseller, Amazon seems to have the better price. So I would suggest that.
Great. And if people want to learn more about Corporate Visions and the programs that you've talked about, best place to go is?
The website. So it's Corporate Visions, all one word, corporatevisions.com. And we have a huge resource library of ebooks and videos and webcasts and things on all of the science-backed concepts that we talk about.
Well, Tim, it's a real pleasure. Thanks so much for your time. And I definitely look forward to continuing this conversation.
Same here, Mark. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us this week on Adapters Advantage, available on all major podcast platforms. Make sure you visit our website, allego.com, where you can subscribe to our podcast so you'll never miss an episode. If you liked this show, you might want to check out our virtual training kit to learn how to keep a remote team running at full speed. Go to allego.com/virtual to download your kit today. Be sure to tune in for our next episode. And don't forget, one new idea can change your life.